Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of the Honorable Michael Signer's new book, Cry Havoc, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until, after over 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors, we wouldn't be here today, and we so appreciate all of you. So, tonight we are beyond excited to have with us the Honorable Michael Signer to launch his new book, Cry Havoc. Signer is the award-winning former mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia, who is a public scholar, executive, and practicing attorney. From 2016 to 2018, he served as mayor of Charlottesville, a AAA-bond-rated city of nearly 50,000. He has been an instructor at the University of Virginia, Virginia Tech, and the University of California. He is the author of two previous books, Demagogue, The Fight to Save Democracy from Its Worst Enemies, and Becoming Madison, The Extraordinary Origins of the Least Likely Founding Father. He has written opinion pieces and essays for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Time, Vox, and Democracy. He has been profiled by NPR, CNN, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Guardian, and interviewed by Meet the Press, Face the Nation, The Rachel Maddow Show, and NPR's Morning Edition. He has received awards from organizations including the Anti-Defamation League, the University of California, DC Alumni Association, the American Society for Yad Vashem, and the Matthew Shepard Foundation. He was recognized by Forward magazine in its Forward 50 2018 list of the most influential Jewish leaders in America. He is also a member of the 2018 class of the Aspen Institute's Rodel Fellows. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from UC Berkeley, where he was a National Science Foundation graduate research fellow, a J.D. from the University of Virginia School of Law, and a B.A. in politics, magna cum laude from Princeton University, where he was a work-study student. He lives with his wife and their twin 5-year-old boys in Charlottesville. Joining him in conversation is Rabbi Jill Jacobs. Rabbi Jill is the executive director of TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, which trains and mobilizes a network of more than 2,000 rabbis and cantors in their communities to bring a moral voice to human rights in North America, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. Rabbi Jacobs has been named 3 times to the Forward's list of 50 influential American Jews, to Newsweek's list of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, and to the Jerusalem Post 2013 list of women to watch. She holds rabbinic ordination and an MA in Talmud from the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she was a Wexner Fellow, an MS in Urban Affairs from Hunter College, and a BA from Columbia University. She is also a graduate of the Mandel Institute Jerusalem Fellows Program. She lives in New York with her husband, Rabbi Guy Austrian, and their 2 daughters. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Michael Signer and Rabbi Jill Jacobs to the stage.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here and to be in conversation with Mike about your book, which I had a chance to read in the last week.
Thank you.
When we think back to Charlottesville, many of us were sitting at home watching with horror. As you know, you were not sitting at home, you were there as Nazis were walking through an American city. And for me, personally, TRUA sent one of our staff members, as well as some of our rabbinic members, to be there with the Jewish community and to be with the interfaith community and to be part of an interfaith counter-protest. So, for me, I'll say that the experience was that I don't use my phone on Shabbat, on the Jewish Sabbath, and so I turned on my phone Saturday night, saw what had happened, and started calling around to make sure that our members and our staff were still alive and were safe. And that was something that perhaps many of us could see coming, at least in the abstract, but perhaps didn't expect to happen as violently as it happened then, or perhaps some people did know that there was violence, that was happening. But I think for most of us, there was this moment of surprise. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what surprised you being in Charlottesville before the events, serving as mayor of Charlottesville, and then seeing what unfolded over that weekend and over that entire summer.
It's a great question. First of all, let me say thanks to Strand for doing this. I lived in New York for a year, and as I talk about in the book, my dad's side of the family is from New York. My grandparents lived in Stuyvesant Town, so I lived there for a year, so I've been at the Strand for hundreds of hours, and it's really an honor, and it's really important what independent bookstores are doing. And Rabbi Jacobs, thank you so much for doing this and for agreeing to do this conversation, especially right now. What surprised me about the events was complicated because the Unite the Right rally that everybody has heard about and that Joe Biden talks about frequently, and that now it was in Spike Lee's movie Black Klansman, was actually the third white nationalist event that happened that year in Charlottesville. There were two prior ones, and the story of how Unite the Right got so explosive and so volatile and so high profile relates to what happened in those prior two events. At the same time that year, you had a parallel set of violent clashes happening in two other American cities, Portland and Berkeley. And you had other clashes happening in European cities where you had very far right groups clashing with far left. So there was an entire context, and a lot of the leaders were looking at what was happening in the other conflicts for cues and trying to predict and trying to understand. And there was a lot of misinformation throughout all this. The thing that, what I feared worse, as I talk about in the book, I kept a journal, and I've kept one for a very long time, and was focused more on writing in it during a lot of these events because it was helping me keep track of what was happening. Several days before the Unite the Right event, I did one long entry where I basically tried to spell out my fears about in granular detail about what could happen. And a lot of that was like walking through the logistics of where this was going to happen, and what if it was disbanded, and what would happen afterward, and what had I been told and not been told about the security plan that the police were going to have. And what really is so sad and infuriating is that a lot, kind of like my worst case fears, almost all came true with a frightening amount of detail. That there was the fire chief had told me this metaphor, and there's a lot in the book about metaphor of fires, firestorm, brush fires, because that's what it felt like. And I feel like that's the best metaphor. He had said, after this thing is likely dispersed, my concern as a fire chief is that there will be these brush fires around the city. And that you're going to have this firestorm or this collision of people coming to the city, both from the left and the right, in response to the right coming. And as I had kind of spelled out how many people, what could happen, could there be riots, could there be killings, the one thing that I didn't count on was that somebody would weaponize a car after the rally was disbanded, even though that had happened in some of these other cities. On top of all of the other horrifying aspects of that's what I think that the murder by James Fields of the Heather Heyer and the awful injuries of several dozen people who were gathered at this pretty joyous celebration after the rally had been disbanded, before it even got started, because it was so unsafe. That I think was the act of terror and domestic terrorism that really set Charlottesville apart from a lot of these other things. The one other thing I'll say that really did surprise me on top of this was we had a briefing 10 days out from the event that we had requested to support the intervention by the political officials to try and relocate the rally to a safer location. And there's a lot in the book about the First Amendment quandaries that we were faced with. To try and do this, we needed better intelligence. We asked for a briefing with the Virginia State Troopers who came in. We had 3 state troopers 10 days before the event, and they spent about an hour talking about the various threats that they were worried about. Most of the time they were focused on the far left, on the Antifa, anti-fascist movement. Nevertheless, we kind of put together this rearguard effort to overrule the police chief, the city manager, the city attorney, hire an outside law firm, relocate this rally to a safer place, got sued, lost the lawsuit. What still haunts me to this day was, why wasn't there intelligence about the paramilitary groups that came to the city? So there were over 10 organized militias who came organized as military groups, basically with command structures and body armor and weaponry and titles and areas that they were assigned to protect. That was the real shortfall at the kind of federal and state levels of gathering intelligence about real terrorists, organized terrorist activities. And that that really was shocking, seeing how sophisticated and planned the paramilitary invasion was. And as we learned, it was planned on a secret online forum that was a gaming platform. And a lot of those facts came to light once that was hacked in the weeks and months afterward. And then there were many independent investigations done about how could people have done this. But at the time, seeing the sophistication and the paramilitary quality of the operation was shocking.
So let's talk about those white nationalists. What the world noticed, of course, was the chant of "Jews will not replace us," which is based in this anti-Semitic theory, this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jews are somehow controlling the world and that every social movement is controlled by Jews. The civil rights movement, it must have been Jews that were somehow controlling it, and Jews are the ones bringing in immigrants and refugees.
Right.
So in Pittsburgh, in the murder and the terrorist attack at the Tree of Life synagogue there, the idea that Jews are bringing refugees and trying to ruin America. So that's the anti-Semitic core, and to what we heard and to many of the theories of white nationalism. And of course, what prompted the rally was the debate that you all were having over the statues in Charlottesville at the time, over the Confederate statues. And these white nationalists were coming in to so-called defend the statues, right? So to defend that white racist history in Charlottesville. And very often we talk about anti-Semitism and racism in two separate categories. We're talking about one of them or we're talking about the other one, but we often don't talk about them in the same conversation. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you experienced and what you learned about the intersections of anti-Semitism and racism, where there are intersections, where they're not, and also just how some of those dynamics played out in what happened in some of the conversations, both before, during, and after within the Charlottesville community.
It's a great question, and it goes to the heart of what white nationalism is right now. So what was incredible to see in face to face with it or during these subsequent events was the facets of today's emboldened kind of stoked white nationalism and how opportunistic it is, and how it's kind of it's like it's like a gathering mass of refuse that is pulling in flotsam and jetsam for its shoddy, historically driven conspiracy theory that is really driven by white grievance. And you can go into a whole history of where otherization comes from and what generates this kind of nationalist white grievance politics, which has been unbelievably deadly over time, in-group and out-group violence. So what was so crazy in this small city where these are really local issues was seeing the racism of these people, which would manifest itself, for instance, in incredibly specific, awful attacks on our African-American vice mayor who had spearheaded this campaign to remove the Robert E. Lee statue, Wes Bellamy. And he and I were very close at the time, and I would hear a lot about not just the hate mail that he was getting, but people driving by his house, specific racist, violent threats that he was receiving that his wife would hear about. This local right-wing blogger who kind of started this whole thing, Jason Kessler, who was the Charlottesville native who conceptualized the Unite the Right rally, along with Richard Spencer, the founder of alt-right, who went to UVA, who came to the city and did these repeated acts and these flash mobs. Jason Kessler was an aggrieved white nationalist who took on Wes Bellamy and tried to eject him from office, and everything that he said about Wes was racist and was framed in terms of black and white. But then at the same time, Jason Kessler, and I tell this in the book, we got this one unbelievably demonic email at this one time before he started this campaign, a year before the Unite the Right rally, when he was trying to eject Bellamy from office. It was an anti-Semitic email where his handle was never forget the 6 million or something like that. And he pretended to be a rabbi, and he somehow created this meld in this racist attack against the vice mayor. He also was attacking Jews and attacking the Holocaust and attacking something in this crazy soup of these ideas. To him, it made sense that his idea of white nationalism was somehow going to express itself in both of those directions. And we saw a lot of that as this went on. So you saw when the Ku Klux Klan came to town, which was the rally, the event, very violent, became violent before the Unite the Right rally, you saw overt racist and anti-Semitic slogans. The Jews will not replace us was only one very camera-ready part of the Unite the Right rally. There was lots of other. It was this kind of crazy quilt of all of the different aspects of what qualifies as white nationalism today. And what was so stunning about it was how comfortable they all felt with each other, given how heterogeneous it was, if that makes sense. You had people there who were attacking, Muslim political refugees coming to Charlottesville, and you had people there who were just off-the-shelf anti-black racists, and you had a lot of anti-Semitism there, and you had Richard Spencer doing a whole rally about me. You had David Duke there, kind of bringing in his angle. You had Stormfront. You had Adam Wasson. So it was really signaling, I think, how broad that coalition of kind of political untouchables wanted to be in achieving legitimacy. That was the craziest part of it. Was it? And I've done a couple of articles since then saying, with Trump, the white nationalism is the feature. It's not the bug. I mean, this is white nationalism. It is ethnic grievance politics seeking to be a political force with violence and crazy conspiracy theories woven right into it. It just expresses itself against a whole host of others, blacks and Jews being very prominent among them.
Right. And I think something that we've learned from the last 4 years, if we didn't know it before, which we should have known it before, is the same people who hate Jews, hate black people, hate immigrants, hate Muslims, hate, fill in the blank. And so the counter to that is, or should be, that those of us who are in those groups, who are minority groups, those who are vulnerable to prejudice and to racism and anti-Semitism, etc., should be supporting each other. And very often what happens is that it becomes a competition between different kinds of oppression. And the idea that either we're talking about racism, or we're talking about sexism, or we're talking about anti-Semitism or homophobia, etc. And I'm wondering if you can talk about if you saw those dynamics play out in Charlottesville and how they played out, and you're thinking about whether there's anything that we can learn from that experience.
They absolutely played out, and it was. I want others to learn from reading the book about how tricky and how tricky these calls are. So I was a Jewish mayor who and a member of the synagogue, and was hearing a lot of pain and anguish from the members and the leadership of Congregation Beth Israel about what had happened. And we had many Jewish leaders coming in from out of town as part of the interfaith coalitions that were coming to support the city and defend the city. And at the same time, you had, especially because of the relative privilege of Jewish Americans and the Jewish community in Charlottesville, as compared to the lack of privilege of the low wealth Black community in Charlottesville, which is directly attributable to de jure, by law, racist, discriminatory practices that have continued in the city up until very recently, and the South and the country. But you had urban renewal that happened in the 1960s, where a very prominent Black neighborhood was razed to the ground and then left fallow for several years afterward. You had Jim Crow, you had massive resistance where the schools were shut down rather than bringing Black students into public schools after Brown v. Board. Those injuries are very raw and very real, and you have systemic poverty inside Charlottesville among the Black community, and it equates all to a very real sense of that is the most raw wound that white nationalism touches. And it was very tricky for me, and I cannot claim to have done any great job in any of this. I wanted to write the book as a learning, not even a memoir, a first person account, in the hopes that others who are a lot smarter than me can make something of all this. There were very tricky times where I remember one time when like there's a saying in a lot of, that I've heard a lot in some far left progressive thinking, that we should go for both and not but or, that but or thinking carries within it inherent oppressive or discriminatory ideation, I guess, about problems, to use a very fancy dime word. But so in my mind, there was this one time when there was a lot of discussion, 2 or 3 meetings after Unite the Right rally, about what had happened to the city. And I think at some point I said, I just want to also say that there's a Jewish community here who was deeply injured by what happened here, because I was hearing a lot about that. The Jewish parents required the outlay of a full-time security guard, and they were scared to have their kids play in the courtyard where the daycare was held, which is a block from the statue. And this is all the whole community having PTSD from seeing this and feeling this happen. And I don't know how broad it was, but I definitely heard some criticism that you should not have equated being Jewish with being Black. And I was like, there was no way that I had any intent of doing that. And I'm sorry if it was heard that way, but I think that it's instructive for leaders trying to kind of navigate this line between how do you express solidarity between multiple marginalized and hurt groups by today's bigotry, while still recognizing differences in privilege among them, which is, I think, the most important thing. And certainly we've seen today, I mean, after George Floyd and after the Black Lives Matter protests, I think we're all hopefully more awake than we ever have been to how the nexus of race and class and historic oppression really has hurt the African-American community. And that's why, and the pain of these sorts of things coming to the city. So, when the Jewish congregation talked about how they felt unprotected because the police refused to put a police car right out front, there's a whole story in the book about that. Can you somehow situate that story alongside how the largely Black residents of the public and affordable housing units felt even more exposed and vulnerable when they felt unprotected because the groups were kind of roaming right next to them? I think that anguish and that terror probably was greater, although the anguish and the terror of the Jewish community was very real. And really, that's where I end up wanting to say it's both and. We can have many different kinds of injury from this horrifying time that we're in, but people have to figure out how to talk about it in the right way.
Yeah, so let's talk about your Jewish identity. I mean, as a rabbi, I have to ask, and you do talk about it a lot in the book, both in terms of the anti-Semitic attacks that you were the victim of, but also there were some really beautiful moments where you talk about being in synagogue and having particular spiritual moments in synagogue. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your own Jewish journey and what changed in your Jewish life based on the events both 3 years ago and even continuing now.
It took me decades to come into being comfortable with my Jewish identity. And I feel comfortable enough now with where I am to be comfortable talking about that. For a long time, I was, and I can't cast judgment at who I was when I was, 8 years old or a teenager or in college. But the fact is that growing up in the DC suburbs in Arlington, I heard my first anti-Semitic slur from a kid who lived around the block of me, probably when I was about 8 years old, and it made a big impact on me. And I wasn't ready, I think, the way I understand it now, to take on voluntarily I guess I saw it as a burden rather than the privilege, and the historical mission and the honor and the richness of the Jewish mission in the world. And so that meant that for me, it was a journey, and there was a lot also that went just into my family composition. We had a mixture of faiths in my household, and my mom was Jewish, but my dad, who adopted me, had Italian Catholicism through his mother, and his father was a secular Jew who grew up in New York. But that was it was this mix around me as I grew up, and I guess going more deeply, I could pass as non-Jewish, and in Canada they have this term of visible minorities, and so I wasn't a visible minority, but it came up, and so there were these key junctures where I said, you know what, I'm not gonna take this identity on. And then at some point, as I started getting older, in my 30s, it started beckoning to me and becoming much more important. And there were real choice points. And there were 2 trips that I made to Israel, which were hugely impactful for me. One was with AIPAC, which is just kind of a leadership trip, I guess. And the other one my wife and I did the year after we got married in 2013, where we went on our own. It was the 65th anniversary, and in combination with my spiritual journey and the causes I found myself latching onto, and the way that my mind was working, and bits and pieces from, I think, my mom and my heritage and my sisters, and where I found myself spending time, it became increasingly important. And then there was this one point where I said, well, there's just no question, despite this whole complicated story, I'm Jewish, and that's who I want to be, and that's who I am, and I'll be however Jewish I want to be, in whichever ways I want to be, and I'm going to make it my own. And I joined the synagogue around that time. And when you and I talked before this, I told you that was different, though. And I didn't campaign on being Jewish. I didn't talk about it publicly. It was a very private thing to me. And there was this one point a year in to being mayor when I did my first state of the city speech. And I said, here are some things you may not know about me. And I said, in addition to all these other things, you may not know that I'm Jewish. And so I see a lot of other Jewish public officials figuring out how and where and in which way to have this be a defining aspect of your identity. And there was this one Rubicon, I guess, that I crossed, and it feels very self-centered talking about all this. I think it's really relevant for others to look at, because lots of leaders are figuring out how to make their own calls on this. And the anti-Semitism in our country is very real, but it's also very subtle. And when Richard Spencer came and attacked the city with 100 people bearing tiki torches, I confronted it as strongly as I could. And there were these key interviews that happened afterward, and I was engaged in Twitter wars with David Duke and all these people. And I was asked by the Associated Press and the New York Times, are you Jewish? And it was really this time when it was like, okay, I guess from now on, that really will be like, it's like I'm a Jewish elected official. I'm a Jewish public, and it was something that 25 years ago, I couldn't have imagined. It felt very easy, felt very comfortable. And I think that by having gone to Israel and seen that model of Jewish toughness and resiliency, and it didn't really matter where you fell on the spectrum of secular to religious, or how you oriented yourself in which tradition, it was a comfortable public identity, and I felt stronger in it. And I think that it gave me a lot of the fortitude to be able to plow through what happened later.
Yeah, I definitely think that, for me at least, over the last 4 years, Jewish history has been kind of a strange comfort, being able to look back and say, we've been in some really bad, certainly much, much worse situations before. Jewish history, there's the bad parts and the worst parts, and like a few nicer parts here and there. And to look back and say that we're part of this longer chain of history. I think for many of us growing up, we heard, America's really comfortable now, but it might not always be, and don't get too comfortable. And to see these 4 years, also beyond these 4 years, but to see these 4 years within that longer chain of history, that, hopefully things will get better in the future, but it's not something that is just completely outside of history.
Yeah.
So I want to switch back to talking about what happened in Charlottesville, and specifically to talk about the question of power. Something that you talk a lot about in the book is that Charlottesville is a weak mayor situation, which I hope that you will explain, because it might be surprising to some folks how little power structurally the mayor actually has. And you made a decision that you were going to take what is a part-time job, very partially paid job, and not without a lot of official power, and you were going to be much more out there and much more public as mayor and take on a role that maybe other mayors hadn't taken on. And it seems like then one of the impacts of that was that there was an assumption that you had more power than you actually structurally had, particularly in relationship to the police. And so I'm wondering if you can reflect on that question of how your power or lack thereof played out, and how you think about how you used power well or not well in that moment, what you might have done differently if you could go back and do it over.
So I started a project, which the last chapter of the book is about, with the Anti-Defamation League and a couple of other founding organizations, the Fetzer Institute, the Charles Koch Institute, which was called Communities Overcoming Extremism, which was meant to generate learning for leaders at all levels in dealing with extremism on the ground. And in part, I think through that, and in part through some other things, I talk now pretty frequently to leaders of other cities who are under this kind of attack and with these clashes happening. Without getting too specific, you all are seeing, like, Kalamazoo, Michigan just had a clash just last couple days ago. Richmond and Minneapolis and Portland and cities all around the country have seen clashes now and political violence. And the first question that I'll ask when I talk to one of these leaders is, what kind of form of government do you have? Because so much stems from the way the government is set up. And a lot of people don't pay attention to local government or to state government. Their focus is on the kind of sexier, higher profile, high wattage levels of federal Congress and the presidency. And the devil is in the details for whether government can effectively deal with problems and forge solutions. The devil is in the details. So that's a long-winded way of getting to your question. 50% of American cities have what's called a council manager, some variety of a council manager form of government, which was a development that happened in the progressive era 120 years ago, when we were trying to make lots of things run scientifically. And America tried to do that to government also. And so a lot of governments, especially at the local level, they said, when we have politicians, elected officials running everything, we're seeing cronyism, we see incredible corruption because politicians are handing out contracts, politicians are doing things like trying to pay for roads, so we're just seeing incompetence. And they said, we're going to professionalize government. So the best parallel for what we have in 50% of American cities, including Charlottesville, is it's like a big company where you've got a board of directors who set policy, or like a university where you've got the board of visitors or the governing board for the university, and you have a CEO or a president who runs the operational details of the city. So for Charlottesville's government was like that. The city manager with the council is the governing board of the city. It's part-time, you make policy, and the question about what distinguishes policy versus operations really matters in crisis management and when you're dealing with things like successive white nationalist violent political invasions like we had. So the council makes policy, you pass budgets, you set direction for the city manager, you hire and fire the city manager, but the city manager usually has a very robust multi-year contract with all kinds of protections built into it that they've negotiated, usually with a professional. So even that relationship is more complicated. And the city manager runs everything. So the police report up to the city manager. The city manager is the emergency manager of the city. The city manager directs the press secretary and the communications director on what to do. The city manager can fire somebody or hire somebody. And that's what we had. We had a very conventional form of council manager government. And I came in, I guess because of where I was in life, and I was very restless and had a lot of gumption and was kind of practicing law, but I really wanted to make mayors typically serve for 2 years. And I came in with I wanted to redevelop, totally unrelated to white nationalism. There was an abandoned hotel on the downtown mall that was very complicated to redevelop because it has low ceilings and no parking and a couple other zoning things. And I was like, I'm going to take that on and I'm going to be operational and I'm going to put together a coalition, and I'm going to put together real estate developers and get council to pass memorandums directing the staff to really work on this and get in touch with the owner. All of that kind of stuff was uncautious, and it was, well, I mean, I think it was well intentioned, but it created a lot of confusion about, a lot of people don't focus on the details, whether I was in fact stronger than a typical weak mayor. The weak mayor, you go to the U.S. Council mayors, weak mayors are principally ceremonial. You do have a very important function in passing the budget. You have an important function in hearing citizen complaints. You do hire and fire the city manager, but you don't really have the time or the staffing or the funding. It's a part, you know, we got paid $16,000 a year. So a lot of mayors, it's like the president and a prime minister of a form of government. They're out there shaking hands and cutting ribbons and really focusing on the ceremonial parts of the office, because people like that sort of thing and people like doing that sort of thing. And I talk in the book about how that wasn't what I wanted to do. And it especially got complicated when we got into the crisis, because we, and I and the other elected officials, had very grave concerns mid-crisis about the actions that the staff who were charged with policing and communications were taking, and we felt they were inadequate. And in the crisis, I stepped in and we put together this whole plan to overrule the staff, and had a lot of conflict. And I still think I probably would do the same thing right now, because the alternative was doing nothing and watching just a sail into disaster. But it created a ton of critique and a lot of second guessing, and it really highlighted the confusions in the system. And when I talk to other mayors now, I'm like, first thing is be clear about your roles and be clear with the public about your roles, and tabletop and rehearse exactly who's doing what before a disaster happens, that you've played out who's doing the press statements and who's talking to, you know, who's taking calls from citizens. How are those getting around? Like when I got a call about the synagogue, a threat against the synagogue that had been posted on the Daily Stormer website, I think it was unclear. I called the Secretary of Public Safety for the state before I called the Chief of Police, because I had that relationship, but I wasn't in the command center where I thought I should have been. So it was, I try to get all this out in the book because it's so similar to what's happening now in dozens and dozens of cities as this country sees this kind of thing more and more. And I think people can learn from it.
Thank you. So I have one more question before we move to questions from the audience. So for those who are there, if you have a question, you can start typing it into the Ask a Question box, and we will get to them. But my last question for now, you have this phrase that your grandfather, that you said you learned from your grandfather, that he used to say, everything becomes its opposite. And one of the ways in which we've seen this is historically, recently, is that democracy, which, you know, I think most of us can't imagine a better system of government than democracy. Don't want to certainly return to a non-democratic system of government, but democracy also can become populism. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit. So toward the end of the book, you bring back this phrase, and you are still very much committed to democracy. And I'm wondering if you can talk about your commitment to democracy, and if and how you still believe in democracy, even though we see both the beauty of democracy and also the ways in which it can descend into dangerous populism.
My grandfather, Herb Signer, he told me that it was around the same period of time that, and we were extremely close. He and Esther was his wife, and they were the ones who lived in Stuyvesant Town, and probably took me to the Strand the first time when I was in elementary school. And I would go and stay with them for a week every summer. He had been a communist, an American communist, after he served in World War II as a Jeep mechanic in the Army. And he and my grandmother had been active in the party and had delisted once Khrushchev disclosed Stalin's war crimes in 1956 or 57, whenever it was. And I just learned that from him. As far as I knew, they were entirely apolitical. They were fascinating, warm, lovely people, but they were not political. And I learned this whole chapter of their life. And then he started talking about other instances where something had become its opposite. And he talked about public housing towers, which seemed like such a good idea at the time. Why not create a where you'll put people who are in the same situation together and forge community? And it ends up being a terrible idea to the people involved. And it really forced on me. I ended up writing my dissertation, and working for many years. My sort of side project for 20 years has been democratic resilience, and how can democracy escape this cycle. The ancient political theorists talked about it as the cycle of regimes, where you were just stuck in the cycle where democracy would become tyranny, tyranny would be overthrown and become democracy, aristocracy sometimes made their way in there. The founding fathers were obsessed with that problem. It's one of the reasons we have so many checks and balances, that America would just invert, like what happened in the French Revolution. You had this incredibly optimistic, ambitious, idealistic scheme that became an emperorship, right, a monarchy right afterward. And so the question, it really backs you into I think you can tell so much from somebody, their outlook on life. It's just, do you believe history moves in a flat line? Are we stuck basically with the same quantum of suffering and cruelty and evil now as we ever have been? It's a very Jewish question, actually, which is, do you believe in whoever you cite, whether it's Martin Luther King or all kinds of theologians, do you believe that history moves upward and how it moves? It is so revelatory where people fall on that question. And our democracy began from a pessimistic fear that we were static unless we would create some pretty extraordinary contraptions through self-government to enable us to move history upward. That's how I take it. That's what I learned, working on my book about Madison. And that's the faith that I brought to everything that I've been involved with, including at this fairly local level in Charlottesville. And I wanted to escape basically the paradox that my grandfather presented to me. Based on his experience, things were becoming their opposites. It was challenging to latch on to anything with great ambitions because of that tendency. They had been apolitical for decades. And I have spent a long time, and I still believe, my wife and I have this constant debate, I'm still an optimist about all of this. I think that there is force and evidence in the fact that human history is moving on a very jagged, like the stock market, a very jagged, steady upward curve with significant depressions and recessions that occur. And how could you assert that human history is moving upward despite things like genocides and the Holocaust, important to us, but there have been many other genocides. And I still believe that when you take the net sum of where humanity is heading, and that's how I look at the stress test of what I see with Trumpism and white nationalism and political violence and this scourge of extremism, and what I saw in this firestorm in Charlottesville, I still come out of it believing that, because it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have faith that we can escape that predicament of everything becoming its opposite, then you have the rough stuff of what pushes the curve upward. And I think when you look at social change agents or advocates or social justice movements, there are people who have sought not to accept futility and the flatline theory of history. And I think the biggest gift you give to authoritarians believe in a flatline theory of history, and they don't care. They don't think history is going anywhere. So then it's just might makes right, really. And so cynicism is the biggest gift you give to tyranny. And so to me, they all connect with one another. And that's why, and it was tricky. It's hard. I mean, the story in this book and what you see in Charlottesville and what you see happening in the country right now is really harrowing. And I've been asked a lot in interviews about the book, how do you come out of this with a credible argument for faith in self-government? And I have lots of proof that there's positive outcomes, and including just through, just one, through the regular old legitimate plain Jane political process in Virginia. There was a massive voter-led revolt against neo-Confederate white nationalist politics in Virginia, and it swept progressive Democrats into every office, and they retook both houses of the legislature, and they hold all the statewide offices, and that's in a state that was the capital of the Confederacy, and that had two prominent statewide Republicans running on neo-Confederate ideas, Ed Gillespie and Corey Stewart in 2017 and 2018, and they were soundly rejected. So you can see just through very regular channels, ordinary people resisting and kind of taking history in their own hands. And then you've seen incredible changes, including Virginia has now overturned the law that prevented cities from doing anything about the Confederate monuments in the first place, along many other things like implementing Medicaid and many other so progressive aims. And it was directly related, I think, to the horrors that we saw. So it is dynamic and progress is possible.
It's a very Jewish answer, because Jews, of course, have always believed that a messianic era is possible, even when
Yes.
The current situation seems to argue very strongly against that. So there's a question about, speaking of the future and speaking of Jews, from Celine Arar. Hopefully I said that right. She says, you talk a lot about how white nationalism is a reality in America right now. What do you say about the future of Jews in America? Do we have one here?
I feel underqualified, Rabbi Jill. I'd actually like to know very much what you think. I'll take a quick swing at it. I mean, I have heard for decades the existential fear that American Jews have, and I think the reason I think I told my story at the beginning is I think I shared that at the beginning. I think it was one of the reasons I was so afraid, I think, of the public identity. And I think that it is by design a incredibly pluralistic country. I think that religious toleration is deep in the bones of the country. Virginia, we feel that very keenly because it really is. I mean, you have religious toleration goes back 2.5 centuries and into the founding documents and the actions of people like Madison and Jefferson and Washington. I'm and then at a personal level, I mean, this is very candid, but my first barely paid job after college was as an assistant director on a production of The Diary Van Frank in a summer stock theater in Massachusetts. And in researching and helping the director for that play, I was 22 years old. I read Rise and Fall of the Third Reich for the first time, and there was this story in it of Jews shaking each other's hands before they were shot in the back in front of trenches. And there was something at that age, that kind of caricature or that fear of Jewish weakness and passivity that is such a stereotype that really haunted me. And when I went to Israel, I got a better idea of Jewish strength and fortitude, as diverse as it can be. And I see it now that I'm older and more well-informed. I see that as the rule and not the exception among American Jewry. But I think that as long as we are confident and strong and well-informed and forceful in our identity and our opinions and the diversity of this people as any people in the United States, then we'll be fine. But I think it requires real vigilance and things as specific as anti-domestic terror measures that are well-funded and well-enforced to root out and crush groups that would employ political violence and fear and terror and intimidation toward their political ends.
So I'll also answer that, and I'm going to throw in, there's a bunch of questions, so I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but there's one question from Noah who says, for both of us, I find the rising tide of hate horrifying and scary. Do you both feel fear about the current state of the country? If so, how do you handle it? So I'm going to merge that with the previous question and say that I can't predict the future of Jews in America. I think that predicting the future is it's not something that one wants to do, because most of us would have been wrong about the way that most of the last few years have turned out, let alone look 10, 20, 50 years into the future. That said, yes, the current situation of our country is very terrifying, and there's, I'm personally very scared about what's going to happen after the election, depending on how it goes. We at TRUA, we just organized a group of our rabbis in Portland, Oregon, to write to DHS to protest the use of federal agents in that city, and those rabbis also were out on the street acting as peacekeepers with other clergy of other faiths. And we see that as we know that the federal government was using Portland as a test run for what could happen, certainly after the election, if Trump doesn't like the results or if there's questions about the results. So that is terrifying. And our options are either to give up and try to crawl under our beds and pretend that the world isn't happening around us, or to fight for what we actually believe and what we actually want. And in my opinion, that's not really a choice at all. Of course, we have to do self-care as well, but we ultimately have to fight for the kind of country we want, and a country where Jews are safe and also immigrants are safe and Blacks are safe and women are safe. And right, we can go down the whole list. And the only way that we're going to get a country like that is by having a country that protects the civil liberties and the rights of everybody. And we know from history that Jews have been historically safer, sometimes in democracies, but not always in democracies, but in places that have strong protections of individual liberties, including religious freedom. So that's a country that certainly I want to fight for, and that I think we have to fight for. Okay, there's maybe I'll go to one last question. Well, there's two questions that I think we can combine. One is from Ruth, who wants to know, for both of us as parents, how do we plan to approach discussions of white supremacy and white nationalism with your children? And from Dan, how does your faith play a role in how you approach public office? Does it shape your morality? That's for you, Mike. And then for me, how does it affect how you lead Shura? So maybe I'll let you have the last word. So maybe I'll take those up, and then,
Right.
and then we'll you for the last couple minutes. So I will start with a question about, my kids are a little bit older than Mike's kids. They're almost 11 and 7. So there's different conversations than you can have with, 5-year-olds. Is that right? Right.
Yeah, almost 6, as they would say, almost 6.
And kids see what's going on in the world. So my kids have a really good sense of what's going on in the world. My almost 11-year-old, she was leafing through your book, which was sitting on our coffee table, and we were talking about it, and she knows what happened in Charlottesville. And so our approach is just to talk really openly about what's happening, to be clear that our role is to keep them safe, but of course we can't promise to keep our kids safe. My kids certainly had a lot of questions about whether somebody was after Pittsburgh, about whether somebody was going to do that in our synagogue. And you can't say, we can't say nobody will ever walk into our synagogue, or for that matter, into your school or into a movie theater or anywhere else. And we can't promise that those will be safe places where nobody starts shooting, because we know that's not necessarily true. But we talk about the reality, but then we also talk about what we're going to do, what we as a family are going to do, and how we're going to go out and how we're going to protest on the street and show our values. So that's where we are. You can talk about having 5-year-olds. And then the question about morality and faith. I lead an organization, as you heard, of 2,000 rabbis. And the reason that Shura exists is that we believe that the role of rabbis and other clergy, the role of religious leaders, is to be moral leaders. There's other roles also, of course, but part of the role of being a religious leader is to be a moral leader and to speak out of morality, which is different than politics. I'm thinking about, I just recently read Masha Gessen's new book, Surviving Autocracy, and she talks in it about the moment before the inauguration that John Lewis, it's very poignant to be talking about him, Representative Lewis, went on Meet the Press and said that he wouldn't go to the inauguration. And he had a quote, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but he said, there are certain things that are just right or wrong. And Trump attacked him and said, it's just talk, talk, talk. And besides, obviously, the disrespect of his civil rights record, also what Gessen said was that what Trump was really rejecting was the whole language of morality. That Lewis wasn't saying, I won't go to the inauguration of a Republican. Right? He would have gone if it had been a different Republican, or he did go to Republican inaugurations in the past. What he was saying is there's something that's wrong here that transcends politics, and that I'm going to speak that language of morality. And Gessen actually argues that the only thing that can, oh good, you can buy the book at the Strand, of course. She says that the only thing that can counter autocracy, that can defeat autocracy, is that language of morality. And so at Shura, we very much take that challenge for ourselves, that we have the power, both the moral power and also the power of people, 2,000 rabbis who reach hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews and others to stand up for what's right out of the depth of Jewish tradition and out of the really the Jewish history and Jewish law and Jewish thought has a lot of very smart people talking to each other about how to create a just world that's just for the largest number of people, and we draw on that to bring that moral voice into the world. So it is 100% of everything that we do at Trua. So I will turn those questions to you to have the last word. So again, one about your kids, how you talk to your kids or how you plan to talk to your kids, and the second about how your own sense of Judaism and morality affected your life as a public official. I know you're no longer a public official.
Well, I really appreciate the question. There's a saying when you write in book writing and editing of killing your darlings. I can't remember who said it along, but the idea is that as you start to write your successive drafts, that you end up having to edit out a lot of the stuff that you really loved, that you felt was absolutely necessary, that were your darlings at the beginning, but then ends up being kind of a rung on the ladder to where the book needs to go. And one of those darlings for me was, there was an original preface to the book, which was a letter to my boys about all of this. And I can maybe loop into one of the other questions, which was, how is this different from the other books, which have been mostly about political theory and history? So this is not a memoir. This is a first person account. And it ended up that this address to my boys about what all had happened and what I wanted them to take from it was just a little too personal. But it ended up being woven in through so many parts of this tract, I think, because my goal is to try and make something of this experience that can be useful to somebody. I was just talking to them about it yesterday, and they're 5 3/4, and it's been really interesting. It's a harrowing read, and it was a harrowing experience, and you're seeing that happen throughout the country, and it is extraordinary to watch Charlottesville accumulate these layers of meaning and be this touchstone as the years go on. I was amazed. There was this 2-hour Discovery Channel documentary that was just released last week, where there was even more investigation and exploration of this. And I want my boys to have a clear-eyed understanding of what the country was like right now, and how could you bring to it both a accurate and a historical comprehension, but a personal commitment to not being cowed by it and still believing in democracy. And I don't think that's easy. It wasn't easy for me. It wasn't easy for me at many junctures. I talked 3 or 4 times about wanting to quit and about going into therapy. And it is a journey, I think, for anybody now dealing with the level of extremism and political violence and intimidation right now. But I still end up authentically at the position that I am, which is teaching them this work is more necessary than ever. It's more crucial than ever, because the stakes are so high on the other side, and because there is provable evidence that resistance and action works, that it can succeed in turning democracy away from these stress points or through them, and achieving higher levels of progress, even through these recessions, these very, very dark moments. There is evidence that it works. And I wanted to say that, that the whole last chapter is about specific ideas, case studies, lessons, practices. Like we sued these paramilitary organizations using this 200-year-old law in this center at Georgetown that came to us that basically makes militias illegal, and it worked. It yielded these binding legal agreements where they agreed not to come back to the city again using these laws. So the rule of law, I would even, we can look at just what's in front of us. We have core institutions that can be refreshed and pushed to deal with these primal ancient horrors that are emerging again. Rule of law, courts, alliances, faith institutions, the press, education, and all of those are firing on all cylinders, I think, right now. But that means that you have to the work is daunting and painful and costly, but necessary. And we had, you know, as after George Floyd's murder, we watched a wonderful PBS documentary that had to talk to your kids about race. It was really good for parents of 5-year-olds. So we did that. We basically followed the playbook and we watched it together, and we talked about Black Lives Mattering over dinner. And then next week at their summer camp, one of the boys was starting a Black Lives Matter club for him and his 5-year-old friends. And however those ideas are going to take root, I think that they need to hear from grown-ups our belief and our faith in the system, as different as our ideas of change are. And a lot of that depends on your personality and your history and what you're able and willing to take on. But to me, there is that's honestly why I wanted to write the book. I wanted to have something to produce from this really insane set of events and an insane experience for me that would be helpful and productive. And the best audience I can think for that is my kids.
Thank you so much. It's really been wonderful to talk tonight. Thank you for writing this book. You can see on the side all of both Mike's book and my books, and Masha Gessen's book, which I mentioned. So yeah, there's, for those of you who have more reading time now, you should definitely buy through the Strand to support that bookstore. And so thank you for being with us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sabir. So thank you for setting this up, Sabir, and to say goodnight and usher us out.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you both so much for an incredible and interesting conversation. It was just illuminating. I really enjoyed it, and I hope all of our audience members did as well. As Rabbi Jacobs so kindly said, if you're looking to purchase any of the books, they're on the side. And so with that, thank you very much, and have a great night, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to the Strand.